Every morning I see him. After I've returned to bed with a cup of coffee, vulnerable in worn t-shirt and night sweat, a balding man with rounded shoulders leans half his body out his window to light a cigarette. I can almost smell his smoke. Sometimes during this ritual I am alone. Sometimes I sleep through it. Sometimes a mess of dark hair and tattoos lies silently next to me. My neighbor drags on his cigarette and looks at me, or I think he looks at me. He is just far enough away that I can't follow the exact target of his gaze. I consider closing the curtain, turning back to the bartender sleeping in my bed, but I've known my neighbor for longer. It is April, and even though the chill of February is safely past, the trees between us refuse to green too early. They bud slower than I fall in love, and I can't imagine that being a good thing. The summer I moved to New York from my small West Texas town felt like a long time coming. Since I can remember, I imagined myself akin to the fragile trees of the Panhandle, a sapling in a place determined to drain me with summers of drought. I uprooted from the desert to find a place where I could grow, a place where things budded and bloomed more easily. I arrived in New York ready to put down roots. When I moved, I was still in love with my husband, a waiter that brewed beer in massive glass bottles and rarely did his own laundry. He called me babe and slept through the day. As summer turned to fall, he began to feel more distant than home. It wasn't long until the short days, the lack of light in our tiny room, the pressure of concrete all around us, made me feel like I was dying. I bought a plant that promised to grow in indirect sunlight. I watered it religiously, hoping this bit of green would be enough for me to hold on a little longer. But the leaves turned pale, then yellow, and 4 months after I moved to New York, I started fantasizing about a substitute teacher I met at my job at a Soho coffee shop. As soon as I realized I wanted to sleep with the substitute, I found the dying plant, the tiny room, and my husband's hurt unbearable. I yanked at the feeble roots that had begun to grip a new life in the city and moved out. Sleeping on the sidewalk seemed softer than sleeping next to someone I didn't love anymore. It was the first new year I saw in New York, and I was so cold I thought about moving home. Instead, I moved into the back room of an apartment in Brooklyn, overlooking a neat row of backyards and towering trees that were already bare for winter. But I spent most of my days that season in the substitute's apartment. The last time the trees flowered outside my window, I was in love with the substitute. He let me smoke his weed and drink his coffee. He called me honey. His room looked onto the street, and all I remember of last summer is the glint of sun on the bus stop, the rhythm of the ever-present ice cream truck, the minutiae of August from his window. After a season of the substitute's callous avoidance of my impending divorce, I became overwhelmed by the reality that I left a life for a man who wished I hadn't lived it. After a few days apart, I asked to meet the substitute on the corner where our streets intersected. Under a flourish of September wind, I cried into his stupid linen shirt one more time and told him I needed to be alone. I spent the rest of the warm days sleeping off a chill. I returned to my own window. The trees were once again shedding the leaves I had neglected to commit to memory. It was the first time in the year since I moved in that I noticed my neighbor, revealed more each day as the leaves between us died and floated to the yards below. I started to wonder about my neighbor. I wondered what he did for work. I wondered if I'd ever passed him on the street. I wondered if he'd seen me masturbate. I wondered if his landlord or partner or child made him smoke out of his window. I wondered if he noticed the recent mornings I spent alone. I wondered if he too feels foolish for not remembering what the trees look like in full bloom. I wondered if he thought about the distance between us, about our closeness despite the space we can't cross, about the ways the lack of green exposes us to each other. I wondered if he would call it intimate. I wondered if he would call it anything at all. There was still thick snow on the ground when I met the bartender. It's April, and the wind rustles the twigs outside my window like a creaky wind chime. I am in love with the bartender. He pulls me close to him in his sleep and calls me sweetheart. We stumble from bar to bar in each other's arms. We kiss in cars that always come to my apartment. We've spent the last 4 months in long mornings in my bed, staying warm with cups of coffee under my comforter. I try to remind myself that I haven't seen a summer from my window yet. But when I trace the curve of his collarbone, I feel tight green buds bubbling on the ends of my fingertips. They betray my better judgment. I am terrified that the moment the tiny buds bloom, his body will become unseasonably cold, like the others I have loved, and that this will be another year of fruitlessness and stunted growth. My neighbor's unchanged morning ritual comforts me. I want to feel that my neighbor and I are mirrors of each other, that my erratic habits match his steady ones, that we are similarly settled in place. I whisper a prayer that my roots have taken hold enough to know when this city will stay warm for a season.